Welcome to the Forecast, a Fortify Rights podcast.
Rohingya armed groups were operating with near impunity, perpetrating really egregious crimes. So killings, torture and ill treatment, abductions, and then threats and harassment.
Some of the crimes that are happening within the refugee camps in Bangladesh have a sufficient connection to the violence that is continuing in Rakhine State.
I urge you to understand the gravity of this situation, the severe threats faced by women human rights defenders in the camps.
Hello and welcome to the Forecast. My name is Patrick Phongsathorn. I'm the Senior Advocacy Specialist at Fortify Rights, and today I'm joined by John Quinley, who is our Director at Fortify Rights as well, and we're going to discuss a recent report that we put out on non-state actors' violence in the camps in Bangladesh. So, hi John, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here. First off, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how this report came about and the research process that went into it.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I appreciate us doing an episode on Rohingya armed groups and militants in Bangladesh and Myanmar. The start of the report really was we started documenting armed actors in Bangladesh and Myanmar, I guess back in 2016, 2017. I mean, ARSA was committing abuses even during those clearance operations that happened during the genocide. And then soon after, you had the huge refugee influx into Bangladesh. Now you have more than about 1 million Rohingya refugees living in the sprawling refugee camps. And in the years that followed, once that influx happened, we saw an uptick in militant and armed grouped violence towards other Rohingya refugees. And that hit a real tipping point with the assassination of the late Mohibullah. Mohibullah was the leader of a very prominent human rights organization, a friend, colleague of Fortify Rights. He was quite active and could really garner huge popular support throughout the camps. And that really made the armed groups at the time, particularly the Arkan Rohingya Salvation Army, known as ARSA, that made them really worried. We had a Mohibullah who was really preaching peace, preaching unity, different things that I think ARSA didn't really want, but also they wanted people to join their group. But instead, a lot of refugees were joining Mohibullah's large civil society organization. So he was a real threat to militant control in the camps, and he was assassinated in September 2021. So at Fortify Rights, we really started documenting the violence after that, and that was when we started our methodology in our report and started doing the more in-depth interviews that we released. So we started documenting cases of threats and harassment towards Rohingya. We documented abductions by Rohingya militant groups. Usually during the abductions, there would be torture and ill treatment involved. And then we also documented killings that rose year on year following Mohibullah's assassination.
But it's quite a departure from other work that we've done on the Rohingya, where we focused on either the people committing genocide against the Rohingya inside Myanmar, the military and their affiliated groups, or we're focusing on the role of the Bangladeshi government in terms of refugee management and the rights around the camps.
Yeah.
So actually to look at a group that is operating within the camps, within the Rohingya community, that must have posed some different kind of challenges in terms of the research process.
Yeah, it's a great question, Patrick. And I think we decided to start documenting militant violence for a number of different reasons. One, our partners, our Rohingya colleagues, Rohingya refugees were speaking in every interview about it. Even if you did an interview about Bangladeshi authorities' restrictions in the camps, we documented extortion by Bangladeshi police against refugees. In those interviews, we kept hearing about militant violence. So we started looking more in detail about it. But also, as an international human rights group, we want to come alongside and accompany other groups working. And the Rohingya groups that were working in the camps couldn't publicly speak out against the militant violence because of threats of reprisals, and real threats of potential more killings. And so we found ourselves in an interesting position where we could really support Rohingya human rights defenders, civil society members that were facing these threats, while also having some protection as an international human rights group. And not a lot of people at that time were documenting the crimes by Rohingya armed groups. So we decided as a team, and our Myanmar team was the one that really spearheaded the work. So we just followed the stories that people shared with us and the abuses that they experienced.
And maybe you can tell us a bit about the findings of the report then, and maybe one or two stories that particularly stick out from your process and memory doing that.
I mean, the main findings of the report is that Rohingya armed groups were operating with near impunity, perpetrating really egregious crimes. So killings, torture and ill treatment, abductions, and then threats and harassment. We found that the Bangladeshi authorities were really lacking in their response, providing protection and safety for Rohingya that were facing abuses, and that also even UN agencies were not providing clear protection mechanisms for them. So some of the recommendations are for more protective spaces in the camps, for refugees that are facing reprisals to have freedom of movement, for investigations into militant and criminal abuses, because very few militants are actually arrested for the crimes they're perpetrating, and the Bangladeshi authorities are not investigating crimes, even killings that took place. The investigations go from 1 or 2 days of interviews with the relatives, and then everything goes quiet. They don't hear from the police again. But we documented numerous stories from relatives of those that were killed. One of them happened at the early 2024. A poet, teacher, human rights defender named Mohammed Fisel was abducted and killed and later found dead. Mohammed Fisel, was, from his associates and other people that we talked to in relation to him, he was approached by the armed groups in the months leading up to his killing. He was asked to join the armed groups to try to recruit more people, and he basically tried to circumvent those approaches and decided not to join them. And for this, we believe he was abducted and killed. Very soon before his killing, he was posting some things online against criminal activity, against armed groups. We know that Mohammed Fisel also helped the Bangladeshi authorities investigate some criminal activity in the camps, including militant groups. And I'm just going to read a poem that Mohammed Fisel wrote on his Facebook before his assassination, because you could tell he was afraid in the camps, like many of the other refugees that we spoke to. So this is a brief poem that he posted on his Facebook. I'm just going to read an abridged version of it. It says, "Darkness makes me afraid, fearing the fire, fearing the robbers. When it's day, I am afraid of kidnappers, hearing the gunshots." These are just some of the sounds that he's hearing throughout his time in the camps, some of the things he's seeing in the camps. He talks about fires. There's been for years kind of arsons and different fires happening in the camps. And of course, hearing the gunshots, people that we spoke to would hear gunshots at night, sometimes in the daytime towards the end of our research. Towards the end of 2024 and now in 2025, there are gunshots in broad daylight in the camps. So this just speaks to some of the real palpable fear that I think refugees are still experiencing.
And what is the motivation behind the violence that's being perpetrated by ARSA and the other groups?
I think it's multifaceted for sure, and I think there's probably not one monolithic answer for it. But I would say one of the main motivations is for command and control of the refugee camps. So there's vying armed groups now. You have ARSA, the Arkan Rohingya Salvation Army, and then you have RSO, Rohingya Solidarity Organization. And then you have a number of smaller groups like the ARA, Arkan Rohingya Army. And then you have gangs like Muna Group and others who have operated. So these all are vying for power in the camps and controlling different parts of the camp. So Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, Balukali, Kutabalong. There's turf wars happening between these armed groups because there's criminal elements in a lot of the armed groups. Drug trading, abduction for ransoms, and then there's also cross-border trading that is quite lucrative. And in the later parts of 2024, basically, we started seeing the armed groups also do forced recruitment in the camps, bringing Rohingya refugee young men across the border to Arakan to fight the Arakan Army, which is an ethnic resistance organization that is fighting against the Myanmar military. The Arakan Army is made up mostly of Buddhist freedom fighters that are trying to win the battle against the illegal military regime. The Arakan Army, though, is really not a group that has respected Rohingya refugee rights. A lot of their senior members are quite racist towards the Rohingya, have openly said openly used discriminatory language against Rohingya. So Rohingya fighters actually started joining the Myanmar military and fighting alongside them to try to fight the AA. And so we started seeing abductions for forced recruitment in Bangladesh, and then people being brought across the border to fight against the Arakan Army. So that's, another major trend we document in the report.
Yeah.
Another main reason for these groups' violence towards people is recruitment. So why human rights defenders and civil society members are targeted is because they have a lot of influence in the camps. These are community leaders, these are people that run organizations, these are teachers, madrasa, people that run madrasas, and they want those people to be on their side and to bring people to fight for them, to bring people to try to speak good about ARSA or RSO. And a lot of these people want to resist. And resisting means abduction, or it means first threats. Then it usually means abduction, then sometimes torture, and then later stages would be killings. And this is a pattern that we documented throughout the report.
And there's a gendered element to this as well, this violence. I mean, I remember reading the report how women who dared go out to work for humanitarian organizations and teachers and things like that were particularly also targeted by Rohingya militants.
Yeah, women human rights defenders, because there's some conservative elements to the armed groups, I wouldn't consider them like their motivations purely religious. They're mostly ethno-nationalist organizations. They try to call themselves freedom fighters fighting for the Rohingya citizenship and rights, which is a just cause. But there are some conservative elements within the armed groups, and they don't like Rohingya women teaching, going to work outside. They don't like Rohingya women speaking against armed groups. They don't like women speaking against their sons, their husbands being abducted to go fight in Arakan. So Rohingya women were being really open about these abuses and really courageous, and sometimes were also targeted. If the women weren't targeted themselves, we talked to some women that were leaders of human rights groups in the camps, small civil society groups. They weren't actually targeted themselves. Their husbands were abducted. When their husbands were abducted, they were told, "Hey, tell your wife to stop her activities." So they're really going after the whole families sometimes.
And I think in your previous answer, you talked about the broader context of violence occurring in Rakhine State, where the Rohingya are originally from, and where they had to flee from after the genocide. And I think one of the other key findings of the report is that some of the crimes that are happening within the refugee camps in Bangladesh have a sufficient connection to the violence that is continuing in Rakhine State, as you mentioned, forced recruitment and the conflict with the Arakan Army, that some of those crimes happening in Bangladesh can actually be considered war crimes, violations of international law. So I think that was also a major finding that we went to Bangladesh to announce. It's not to say that war crimes are happening in Bangladesh. I think that we need to make that clear, but that there is a sufficient nexus between what ARSA are doing in the camps and their activities in Rakhine State, and there is legal precedent for that in Rwanda and in the former Yugoslavia as well. So,
I think I'm happy you mentioned that, Patrick, because Bangladesh has always been really supportive of international criminal investigations, international justice mechanisms. They've allowed over many years under the former Hasina regime and now under Dr. Yunus interim government, they've always allowed the ICC into the borders. They've always allowed members of the ICJ, Gambia legal team into their borders. The former prosecutor at the ICC was the one that opened the case on the crime against humanity of deportation, and Bangladesh is a signatory to the Rome Statute. So, they're in a really interesting position. Like you said, war crimes aren't necessarily happening on Bangladeshi soil, but they have this interesting opportunity to help the victims of these crimes have large international justice because of this nexus, war crimes nexus happening. So I think, a really important point.
And while we were actually out in Bangladesh launching the report, there was a potential step forward in terms of accountability with the arrest of Ataullah, who was a commander of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. That was dramatic for us personally, but I mean, what does it mean in terms of accountability and for the Rohingya community in the camps?
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. They announced his arrest the same day, the early morning hours of the same day before we released our report. We don't know how long he was detained for before they announced it publicly, right? He could have been detained for weeks, days. They could have arrested him that night. We don't know all the answers, and I don't want to speculate on the podcast. But it was an amazing step forward for victims of these crimes, people that were killed, for families of the relatives that lost loved ones, and for those that are now in hiding because they experienced torture, ill treatment, or other things. And so, Bangladesh did the right thing. They arrested Ataullah and also some of his senior members of his armed group. Ataullah has been commanding and controlling ARSA since 2016, 2017, even before that under its previous name. And he has responsibility as a commander, and he should be held accountable for the egregious crimes that we documented in the report, including war crimes, like you mentioned. So yeah, I think it's a step in the right direction. We hope that Bangladesh works with the ICC to be able to prosecute him for war crimes. He's been arrested for also linked to killing of a Bangladeshi security force member, and he's being now brought through domestic courts. We believe in the Bangladeshi domestic justice system, and it's making there's been some really amazing changes since Yunus has come to power, but we think, particularly Ataullah as the senior commander of ARSA should also be tried by the ICC, or at least investigated by the ICC. So we believe Bangladesh should be working closely with the ICC on this particular case. Maybe lower level members of militant groups could be tried in domestic courts or use other justice mechanisms, but Ataullah should really be the Bangladeshis should really be working with international justice mechanisms on his case. Absolutely.
And a final question, I think. There's a lot going on right now in that area of the world, in Bangladesh. In Myanmar, obviously, we have civil war and crimes against humanity happening. But in Bangladesh as well, we have political turmoil. We have this interim government. We don't know how long it's going to last, when they're going to have elections. And at the center of all of this is the Rohingya community in those camps in Cox's Bazar. So what do you think is the forecast for the Rohingya community? What does the political situation in Bangladesh mean for the Rohingya? What does the situation in Rakhine State mean for any potential repatriation of the Rohingya community? We've also got a big global summit on the Rohingya happening in New York later this year. What are some of the outcomes that you'd like to see from that meeting?
Yeah, I think it's a pivotal time for Rohingya. I think Bangladesh going through the amount of changes that it's gone through, democratic changes, human rights changes, they're starting commissions domestically to investigate enforced disappearances, to support victims of the crimes that happened in the July and August protests against the former leader, Sheikh Hasina. So, Mohammed Yunus leading the interim government is a really good opportunity, and Yunus has been a humanitarian his whole life. He's worked with the poor his whole life, marginalized communities his whole life. So we hope the Mohammed Yunus government takes a different approach than Sheikh Hasina. They could easily allow refugees more opportunities to have livelihoods in the camps.
Yeah.
There could be a broader education program. Right now there's just a very small pilot project. There's no real formal education for Rohingya refugee children and youth in the camps. That's a big problem. And there's really no freedom of movement for people in the camps. They're trapped inside fencing, barbed wire fencing. Be able to leave, they have to sometimes pay authorities to leave. And a lot of these general restrictions that are taking place for Rohingya every day, the Yunus government could change these policies. On repatriation at this time would be considered, I think, refoulement. Sending people back to Arkan State, as you mentioned earlier, it's an act of war against, there's still airstrikes happening there, there's artillery fire happening in the central Myanmar, and the Arkan army is committing pretty egregious abuses against Rohingya people themselves. There needs to be humanitarian support reaching Arkan, and we believe the Bangladeshi authorities should open a humanitarian corridor to allow aid, medicine, food items into particularly northern Rakhine State, Mongda, Butidong, Ratidong. Those places, very little is getting in. It's very dire. And so the Bangladeshis should be cooperating with the Arkan army to be able to send aid across. The Arkan army is not a perfect actor. Our colleagues and us at Fortify Rights have documented major abuses by the Arkan army, and so I'm not saying they're a perfect actor. But when it comes to humanitarian aid, medicine, food, general things getting into Rakhine State, I think they should be worked with, and the Bangladeshis should continue those negotiations that have been ongoing for months. I think on the summit, Patrick, it'd be great to hear from you. I know there's a lot of pledges, that they want to make. I'm really wanting to see more Rohingya representation. I know it's in New York City. And I want to see Rohingya refugees from the Bangladeshi camps go to New York, be able to represent themselves there. But I don't know, from your side, I know you follow more global advocacy than I do, so what you're looking forward to from the Rohingya conference?
Well, yeah, definitely. I think active participation from refugees themselves is absolutely necessary, and not just being on the table, around the table, but making decisions as well, and being really intertwined with the processes that are happening about them. They should be involved in them. So that's one thing. I think, obviously, with the destruction of USAID and the US's global soft power and diplomatic weight, other actors are going to have to step up. And I think in this particular context where we can't really envision sustainable return in the current situation, there needs to be more broader thinking, there needs to be more innovative thinking about what the future for the Rohingya refugees, almost 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, looks like, whether that is resettlement. It's going to be tricky, but there might be a role for greater numbers of resettlement, whether that is some kind of integration into Bangladeshi society, maybe in slow, gradual ways for a minority of refugees, perhaps, or other approaches, stabilization of the population somehow through maybe humanitarian corridors, stabilization of the population in certain areas of Rakhine State. But that's going to be, again, none of these are good options, actually, really. Obviously, the thing that we really want to see is peace in Myanmar. More generally, we want to see accountability, which goes hand in hand with peace in Myanmar. And there needs to be accountability for the Rohingya, and obviously they need to have their citizenship and rights restored. And that's what they've always told us, that as a kind of primary thing that they need before they can consider going back. So big challenges, but the international community, especially Southeast Asian nations, especially Islamic nations, they have remained engaged in the Rohingya situation. So that's really great to see. And I think if they put their minds together and work with refugees and work with host communities, then perhaps some solutions at least can be found in September, October, I think, when the conference is happening.
I do just want to say, Patrick, on the conference, we want Rohingya representation, widespread representation. That means political organizations, human rights defenders, not just at the conference, but for Rohingya people broadly, right? And these armed actors have always been criticized as abusers of refugees, of being terrorist groups. Us at Fortify Rights, we're not a pacifist organization. We believe in the right to struggle against an oppressor, but we need those groups that are fighting just wars to be able to abide by international law. And so we will continue to at least document crimes by all parties. That means crimes happening in Karen State, Karenni State, Rakhine State, Bangladesh, by all actors in this ongoing war in Myanmar. So I just wanted to make that point as well. We've been criticized by, I think, people online and kind of the broader Rohingya community about being overly critical of these armed groups. We believe that some of these armed groups are responsible for international crimes, so they should be perpetrated regardless of the potential righteous cause that they claim to fight for.
Right.
And we do want to see proper government structures, proper administrative structures, proper political systems being run by Rohingya people. You have this in other ethnic communities in Myanmar. You have in Karen State, you have the KNU running a whole government system. In Karenni, you have the IEC, a whole state-level government structure. This could happen for the Rohingya, and we want to see that happen. But when it comes to documenting abuses, we'll continue to document abuses that happen in Bangladesh by the armed actors.
And to what extent do you think that a Rohingya-run administration in Rakhine State could live alongside an Arakan-run administration in Rakhine State?
Yeah, I think there's a potential. There's obviously deep-seated grievances right now, and there's a need to end the ongoing abuses that are being committed by the AA against Rohingya people. And also the Rohingya armed groups are actively fighting the AA sometimes. So those skirmishes, that conflict needs to stop for real dialogue to start taking place. Before the 2021 illegal military coup that happened in Myanmar, there was a document signed by a number of diaspora leaders and community members in Myanmar called the Archon Declaration. And that was a group of Muslims, Buddhists, different political actors, leaders of their community. And that Archon Declaration said that we want to live peacefully alongside each other and build a society together. It wasn't a perfect document, but after the coup, a lot of those conversations fell to the wayside because everyone just started focusing on the junta abuses, which is the right thing to do. But over the long term, I think, I talk to Rohingya friends and they have Rakhine colleagues, and I talk to Rakhine people and they have Rohingya friends. And so I think I'm very hopeful in the youth movement, in a lot of Rohingya youth and Rakhine youth, and being able to build those bridges for long-term kind of harmony and peace in the country and living alongside each other. And I think the ULA, which is the Archon Army's political wing, they could have much broader representation of Rohingya people in their administrative structure. Right now, there's some very low-ranking Rohingya people within the ULA. The NUG, the National Unity Government, has led the charge on this. They have an appointed Rohingya representative, Ong Jo Mo. He's doing a great job in his mandate as a human rights minister. But we need to see more Muslims and more Rohingya people in positions of leadership, in real political positions, to see that change.
Yeah. But even the NUG, the progress on Rohingya rights seems to have stalled somewhat. I mean, they talked about rewriting the citizenship law, but haven't really heard anything about that recently.
Yeah, I mean, they've made some very strong statements doing away with the national verification process, NVC process, which never allowed Rohingya to self-identify as Rohingya, stripped them of their identity. They put out a statement early on after the coup saying, the NVC is an illegal tool and shouldn't be used. They made a statement saying that Rohingya will have citizenship in Myanmar, and then they're in the process of reviewing the citizenship law. So we are in ongoing conversations with the National Unity Government to make sure that the citizenship law is not a tiered citizenship system, and that it's not based on race or religion. And those elements of it, historically under the 1982 law, were the real problematic elements. And we want to see those portions done away with. The NUG and others in the broader resistance are still putting a lot of time on the battlefield, and I hope, I can only be hopeful in this regard once they liberate more areas, are able to actually grant Rohingya citizenship in real time, that they make the right decision and do that. And we'll publicly say that until it happens, until Rohingya citizenship is restored.
Okay, so I think on that hopeful note, we'll close the conversation now, but I just want to say thank you for joining us today, John, and thanks for your work alongside the Myanmar and Rohingya team at Fortify Rights on this report. And if you'd like to read this report, please do go to our website. It's called, the report's called I Could Be Killed at Any Moment. So please do go and read that.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And I really want to also thank the Rohingya people that we spoke to for the report. We interviewed over 100 people, and they all went to great lengths to speak to us and spend a lot of time with us, so I want to thank them. To close out this podcast, we also have a short recording from a Rohingya woman human rights defender. She's experienced abuses by militant groups herself. Her identity is not being disclosed, and she's now in hiding, but we're going to share a short audio recording from her.
I am a female human rights defender who formerly lived in the camp. However, due to relentless threats and torture by militant groups, my family and I have been forced into hiding outside the camp. I am also aware that numerous other human rights defenders, both women and men, remain in the camps, enduring similar forms of torture and threats. I urge you to understand the gravity of this situation, the severe threats faced by women human rights defenders in the camps, including physical violence, mental torture, death threats, and other forms of abuse. As a woman human rights defender, I have personally experienced, and my research has further found. Since 2019 till today, the armed criminal groups in the camp have continued to torture women without restraint. They also torture men, and it hasn't ceased yet. Militant groups do not solely inflict this violence, but the Myanmar junta and the Arakan army also target male and female activists in the camps. Those who are doing activities against them are subjected to brutal torture, who oppose them using their agents, those who stand against the Arakan army, and even death through the use of proxy agents. Furthermore, support for male and female human rights defenders has significantly declined compared to previous years. I would request you all to work to halt the crimes being committed against women human rights defenders in the camp.
I